So the title of the talk is Trust, Security, and Society. And what this really is a talk about my new book, which came out a couple of months ago. And there's one here. I'll wave this around at the end of the talk. It's maybe you could also call this talk, What I Did in 2001. This is the culmination of a lot of research about security and trust. Really my sort of endless quest to look at security in context and figure out, what's going on, why and how. And this really led me to thinking about trust. And I sort of invite all of us to think about how trust works in society. I mean, just today, right? I wake up in a hotel in a strange country. I'm sure many people in this building have an ability to get into my hotel and have a pass key. I go downstairs, I eat breakfast, served to me, food by strangers. I go outside and walk around, and again, I'm passing strangers in the street, and nobody's attacking me. Right? I come to this conference, lots of people here. Right? I'm feeling perfectly safe. We're in this room. The amount, yesterday I got on an airplane, the amount of trust there, not just the pilot and the crew, but the airports and the people, and let's not forget the taxi ride from the airport. This is the numbers of times we trust people are enormous, and they're so great we don't even really think about it. And I think that is the true measure of how well trust works in our species and society, that we do it so often, thousands of times a day, right? I see people drinking the bottled water. No one's worried that it's poison. No one's actually worried. We're not worried that the ceiling's going to collapse on us here. Right? So trust is essential to society. Society does not function without trust. And it's also unique to our species. We are a trusting species. And I mentioned we're all sitting in this room, mostly strangers, and nobody's worried that someone else will jump up and attack them. You laugh because that's normal. But if we were a species of chimpanzees, this would be impossible. Right? We would not be able to do this. Only humans can do this. Right? That can trust strangers at this level. We do it thousands of times a day. We do it reflexively. So what I want to talk about is trust in society, how society makes this work. And to me, this is a way of thinking about society, and it's a way of thinking about society's problems that I think is useful and illustrative. Again, this talk is really distilled out of my latest book, Liars and Outliers, of which copies are available over there. Not many. Right? And it is a security talk. It is very much a security talk. It's a talk about society's role in enabling the security that enables society. Right? It's about trust in society, sort of less why it's important. A lot of people write about why trust is important. I kind of take that as a given. I'm more interested in how society induces it. What is it that's going on in this room that we can be sure that nobody will attack us or pickpocket us or jump up, grab our computers, and leave? We don't think of it, but that's actually an interesting question. Right? How does society use security to enable trust? And fundamentally, it's a talk about group interest versus self-interest and how the group enforces its interest on individuals within the group. All right, so let's think about trust for a second. Now, trust is a really complicated concept. Right? And as a word, it's very overloaded with many meanings. Like the word security, which has an extraordinarily different number of meanings, trust also has a lot of different meanings. And I think that speaks to the richness of the concept and its importance, that the word is so overloaded with nuance that you almost can't use it without qualifying it. So there is a personal, intimate sort of trust. Right? When you say, I trust a friend, you're not really speaking about their actions. You're speaking about them as a person. Right? I trust you. What does that mean? That means I have some general belief and general reliance that you'll behave in some trustworthy manner. Right? That I know your intentions, right? I know who you are, and I know that those intentions will inform your actions. I mean, it's a very personal form of trust. A family member, a friend, a spouse. That's actually not what I'm talking about here. Right? I mean, because there's also a less intimate and less personal form of trust. Right? When I trusted the taxi driver to take me to this hotel without cheating me, I had no idea who this taxi driver was. The taxi driver might have been, a mass murderer by night. I actually didn't care. I trusted that he would drive me from the airport to this hotel with the meter on. That's it. Right? So I don't know him personally. I don't know his motivations, but I can still trust his actions in that context. Right? I don't know if he wants to steal. I just know that he won't right now with me. And that's good enough. Now, that's an odd form of trust, right? You could think of it as a little bit like confidence. You could think of the cab driver's trustworthiness more like compliance. You could think of this as reducing trust to consistency or predictability. Right? I go to get off the plane, go to the taxi cab stand, and it's predictable. Right? I mean, I sort of know what's going to happen. Right? Now, that depends on context, right? I mean, if there was a different city, if we were in Mogadishu, I might not have that same level of trust. So when people are trustworthy in this way, the phrase I use is they're cooperative. They're cooperating with whatever social norm we have. The social norm between taxi driver and passenger. The social norms in this room. Right? The social norms on the street when we pass each other. Right? And that social norm is, you don't pickpocket each other. You just walk by and maybe you nod. Or maybe you say hello, which depends on culture. So in today's society, we trust people in this way. Actually, it's not only people. We trust institutions and we trust systems. I mean, thinking back to that airplane, it's not really that I trusted the particular pilot to fly me to Amsterdam. It's I kind of trusted the airline that produced him, right? That KLM has whatever systems in place to produce reliable pilots. I don't have to worry about what those systems are. I trust that the airline will generate a suitable pilot for my plane in the morning. Right? I mean, it's not that I really trusted that taxi driver, but the whole system that produced him. The licensing system and whatever airport systems are in place and the meter. And I also trust the more abstract systems. Just yesterday, I got some euros out of an ATM machine. It's kind of an amazing thing. Right? I put a card in a slot, push some buttons, and I get local money, trusting implicitly by some magical system that a similar amount will be debited from my account in the United States. I don't know how that system works, and I don't have to care. Right? I have trust in it. So that's trust, that's cooperation. So my thesis is all complex systems require cooperation. Right? All complex ecosystems require cooperation. And this is true for biological systems, it's true for social systems, and it's true for socio-technical systems. Also, in any cooperative system, there is an alternative parasitical strategy. This is true for tapeworms in your digestive tract. This is true for thieves in a market. This is true for spammers in email. right? This is true for companies who move their profits offshore to evade taxes. Right? In any system of cooperation, there is an alternative, uncooperative strategy. Right? Among us sitting here politely listening to me, there's the alternative strategy of picking each other's pocket. And using the terminology from game theory, I'm going to call these parasites defectors. And the fundamental model I use in the book is the prisoner's dilemma, the cooperators versus defectors. And I'm not going to go into the details. I hope most of you know it. It's a great thought experiment from game theory that illustrates the fundamental tension between cooperating and defecting. And there are real-world examples of it everywhere. It actually is a great model to look at human conflict. All right, so parasites can only survive if they're not too successful. Right? If the number of defectors gets too large, society collapses, right? The whole system collapses. And if too many people steal, then, there's no such thing as property. If the tapeworms in your digestive tract get too greedy, you die and they die. Right? Too many thieves in the bazaar collapses and there are no more thieves. If there's too much spam on email, we all say, I don't read email anymore, there's too much spam, and the spam is now useless. Right? If too many people don't pay their taxes, government stops functioning. Right? So these defectors sort of have some natural limit to how well they can do by the system itself. And there is this fundamental tension between cooperating and defecting. You could think of it as a tension between us as individuals and us collectively as society. Right? So, we might individually want each other's stuff, but we're all better off living in a society with no one steals. Right? We might individually want to not pay our taxes, but we are all better off living in a society where everybody does. And it's actually even weirder than that. Individually, I want your stuff. Right? As a member of the group, I want to live in a society where no one steals. Right? I'm better off that way. But if you think about it, I'm much better off living in a society where no one steals and taking your stuff. Right? I get the benefit of stealing and the benefit of living in a theft-free society. Right, but that's the dilemma. If everyone acts that way, society collapses. And so most of us realize this. Right? This is not, when you think about the prisoner's dilemma, this is not something that is, in a sense, difficult. Most of us understand that it's in our long-term best interest not to act in our short-term self-interest. But of course, not everybody does in all situations, and that's why we need security. Right? That's where security comes in. Right? Security is how we keep the number of defectors down to some acceptable minimum. Right? Security is how we induce cooperation, which in turn induces trustworthiness, which in turn enables trust. Right? So security is what keeps us in this room from not stealing from each other, which induces us in this room to be trustworthy, which makes us feel comfortable, right? Why we feel trust in this room. Why we don't have to think about, someone's going to steal from me. But that we can just forget about it. All right, now note here, I'm making no claims about the moral stance of defectors. And I think this is important. What I'm really talking about is how groups enforce norms. And this dynamic works for a community of citizens, right? Or this room, the community of people at this conference. It also works for a community of criminals who are trying to enforce some criminal code on their members, right? And defecting might be talking to the police, Right? So the mechanisms are not based on some abstract moral absolute. They're really about the group and the group's norms. So the phrase I use to talk about the mechanisms by which we as a group induce cooperation, I call societal pressures. And I like this term because they really are pressures. Right? They're not absolutes, but they're ways we nudge each other, nudge us individually to behave cooperatively. And, like any, real pressures, they don't completely eliminate defectors. Right? The goal isn't to have a society where crime is zero, and I'll talk about that later. The goal is to get defection down to some manageable number that's low enough that we all can trust. So there are 4 different types of societal pressures, and I'll go through them in turn, that we use to induce cooperation. The first one is morals. And by morals, I mean something very general. I mean anything that's in our own heads that induces cooperation. Right? Most of us don't steal not because it's illegal, but because we know it's wrong. We feel bad if we do. Right? Or we feel guilty. We don't want to. And this is true for a lot of cooperation. Right? The majority of our cooperative behavior comes because we want to do it. Because in our head, we want to do right and don't want to do wrong. However we define that. Right? Some of that's going to be cultural. Some of that'll be innate. There's some great research on the neuroscience of morals, on how much of this is inside our head, is evolutionarily inside our heads, and how much is imposed from society. Now, you can see examples from other species. So that's morals. The second type is reputation. And by reputation, I mean also very generally anything that involves what other people think of our actions. This is a very different and a much stronger societal pressure, right? How others respond to our actions. And it's very basic, right? We get praised for good behavior and we get snubbed for bad behavior. And this probably controls a lot of cooperation in this community. What the rest of us will think of us if we do something that is as uncooperative, if we defect, if we act like a parasite on this community. And it's informal. If I have a friend over to visit and he steals my sweater, I'm not going to call the police. I'm just not going to invite him over again. Right? That informal retribution is how reputational pressures work. So these 2 societal pressures are very old, right? Morals and reputation. They're as old as society. They're as old as our species. There are any number of researchers who look at language as being developed in part for this. Right? Gossip is a way of enhancing reputational systems. And being able to give information about each other to each other. In a lot of cases, this stuff is older than humanity. Right? You can see morals and reputation working in other primates and other mammals. You can see vestigial examples of both of these. Oh, someone's cell phone. Right? So this is really our primitive societal toolbox. Right? This is what we used as primitive small communities. And they can be very powerful. I mean, the extreme retribution for reputation is ostracism. Right? Removing someone from the community. And it's sort of interesting. We as humans are somewhat unique in this. I mean, you can see other primates act on reputational information. I mean, you see experiments with chimpanzees, where based on what they know about each other, they will behave differently. But humans are the only species that can transfer reputational information. Right? I can tell you about him. I mean, no one else does that. Humans are unique in that. And that is a huge difference. And there are people who think that language was developed mostly because of that. That was the driving force behind language development. Right? But those two, morals and reputation, work, but they don't scale. Right? The problem is society gets bigger, more complex, and those two alone aren't enough to ensure cooperation. Right? So we have two more societal pressures. We have laws that formalize reputation and technologies that also induce security. Right? So my third type of societal pressure is institutions, laws. Right? Because institutions have rules. They are effectively norms that have been codified and whose enforcement has been delegated. Right? So we as a group have designated those people to enforce the norms of not stealing or not speeding on the highway. So whatever laws we want to talk about. Right? And so you have a variety of institutional pressures that induce people to behave according to the group norms. And the whole field of criminology fits here. Right? And lastly, we have security systems, right? Actual mechanisms designed to induce cooperation, right? Prevent defection, induce trust, compel compliance, sort of whatever mechanism you're looking at. And it's, is it door locks and tall fences, or alarm systems, or forensic and audit systems, mitigation and recovery systems. I mean, it's sort of complex. Some of them work before the fact, some of them work after, some have a deterrence effect, right? Some don't. You can really map these out in a pretty complex way. And all of them work together. Right? I mean, I don't know, take the easy example of stealing. Right? Most of us aren't stealing because we know it's wrong. Some of us aren't stealing because what our friends will think of us. Right? The rest of us aren't stealing because it's illegal and we'll go to jail. And for people that those three things don't prevent, we have door locks. And the interesting thing, I think this is really interesting, that our community, which spends pretty much its entire time in this little piece, the technical security measures, we're largely ignoring everything else. So often our security discussions are extremely narrow, that we're not really looking at the full range of mechanisms, of societal pressures that we could bring to bear on a cooperation problem, on a trust issue. Right? So the way I think about it is that individuals are making this cooperate defect decision. Right? Should I steal or should I not steal? Right? I'm deciding right now. Right? I'm going to decide based on whatever criteria I have. These societal pressures are a way for society to put its finger on the scales. Right? They make it more beneficial for me to cooperate and less beneficial, and less beneficial for me to defect. Right? And how well they work depends a lot on context. Actually, let me give one example. I probably should have said this earlier. It's a neat experiment, and it talks about the power of reputational pressure. So it's an experiment done at an office coffee machine. And the way the coffee machine worked is you'd take a cup of coffee and you drop, a coin in the box, whatever the coffee cost. And you sort of think about how this works. To cooperate means you pay for your coffee. To defect means you take the coffee and don't pay, right? So you can measure cooperation rates. If you know how much coffee you have and you see how much money you have at the end of the day, you actually can figure out what percentage of people cooperate. Actually, you can figure out sort of what percentage of the total amount you should have you do have. You don't actually know if it's more people paying less or fewer people paying the whole amount. So what the experimenters did is a great piece of research, is they put a sign behind the coffee machine that had a picture of a pair of eyes. And they found that the cooperation rate increased dramatically. That when people just thought that someone might be looking, they see a pair of eyes, they actually paid more for their coffee. Right? The control was a picture of a bunch of flowers. Right? That's how powerful, right, our need for a good reputation is. Sorry, that's just a great experiment. So anyway, right, people are making this cooperate defect decision. Society is using pressures to put its fingers on the scale, and we're trying to find this optimal balance between cooperators and defectors, right? And it's not zero defectors, right? Having too many defectors, of course, is expensive. But having too many cooperators is also expensive because you're spending more money on security. Right? So there is this natural level, right? This a natural crime rate. I mean, I don't know what the crime rate is here in Amsterdam, but it's not zero. It's some low amount that's low enough that we're all, feel trusting and we're all feel safe walking the streets. And societal pressures allow society to scale. I mean, these are the mechanisms by which society was allowed to grow. Right? All those primitive systems are enough for small communities, but larger communities require delegation and more formalism. Right? And global systems require, even stronger global laws and large-scale security technologies. So this way of looking at society, I think, has strong explanatory power. And in the book, I talk about this in relation to terrorism, the financial crisis, organized crime, internet crime, sort of a bunch of other things. Now, you have to understand I'm simplifying greatly here. This is actually all very complicated. Right? In my book, I'm drawing from psychology and economics and game theory, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, philosophy, anthropology, archaeology, history, political science, laws, a little bit of theology. One of the hard things about writing this was to figure out the boundaries of my topic, because this quickly flows into a lot of different disciplines. And it could have been a huge and uninteresting book if I didn't, put boundaries on it. Right? There's a lot of places to take this research. Give you a few of them. I've been talking about self-interest versus group interest, but that's really a simplification. Right? Often there are many competing interests. Right? Your interest as an employee of a company versus your interest as a member of society. As an example. Right? And different groups will use societal pressures to further their own group interest. Right? There are different aspects of ourselves, that can be in conflict with each other. Right? The interactions between morality and law are really a separate topic and very interesting. How each of these different pressures scale is important. And for us living in a technological world, how technology helps make them scale. Right? The effects of group decision-making is another complication. A lot of these cooperate defect decisions aren't made by individuals, they're made by groups. Right? An organization, a company decides. Right? And the dynamics of group decision-making is real important. And how this plays out in common groups. I mean, I have a separate chapter on organizations, another chapter on corporations, another chapter on government institutions. Right? There are a lot of specific dynamics that play out in those different sorts of groups. Right? And again, how this scales as society gets larger and more complex. I mentioned this earlier, but what happens when the defectors are in the right? I mean, how does this work with police informants? or conscientious objectors to a military action, or civil disobedience. Right? I mean, I can spend sort of hours on this, but I'm not. A lot of it's in the book, and I think a lot of it really is a separate topic. What I want to talk about here, and I'll do a little bit more, and then leave a bunch of time for questions, is to talk about the effects of technology. Because as technologists, how technology changes things is real important. So basically, technology allows society to scale. Right? Technology allows our society to get bigger. And scale affects societal pressures in a lot of different ways. Right? There are more people. There's more complexity. There are new social systems. There are new security systems. There's increased technological intensity. There's increased frequency. There's increased distance. And you can sort of see some of that stuff when you think about the internet. Right? The internet allows crime to happen across greater geographical area. Right? Automation, you think of some kind of automated hacking tools, increases frequency. Right? New social systems like Facebook also change things, increase complexity. I mean, lots of examples of complexity affecting security. More people, right? The more people get on the internet, the more dangers there are just because of the scale. Right? I mean, you can sort of imagine how all of those things affect societal pressures. But, so the meta point is, if you think about societal pressures as resulting in some balance between cooperators and defectors, technological advances upset that balance. Right? We have some balance of banking fraud that we're happy with. Someone invents the internet, banks go on the internet, and now the balance has changed. Right? There's now more banking fraud because there's a new attack vector. We have a murder rate that we're happy with, and someone invents a gun. And suddenly the murder rate increases. Right? Or there's some crime rate that's all right, and then someone invents fingerprint technology. And that upsets in general, new technologies upset this balance. And in response, right, society has to rebalance. We have some new societal pressures, maybe some new laws or some new technologies. Maybe there's some group norm that gets reflected in the reputational pressures. Now, this is an iterative process, right? This is not a scientific process. And it's hard to get this right. But, this is how we get stability in society. This is how society manages to remain stable even as technologies increase, right? Even as things change. The problem is that attackers have a natural advantage. Right? That in this balancing and rebalancing, attackers have the upper hand. Right? They can make use of innovations faster. What's a good example? Someone invents a motor car, and the police say, "Oh, that's an interesting idea," and they, form an exploratory committee to decide whether they should buy a motor car. And they produce an RFP, and they go out for bids, and they get proposals, and they evaluate the proposals, and they procure the car. Then they have a training program, and they figure out how to use the car. Right? Meanwhile, the criminal says, "Oh, look, new getaway vehicle," right? And can very quickly use a car in whatever crimes he's committing. Right? We saw that same thing on the internet. Pretty much as soon as internet commerce appeared, we saw a new breed of cyber criminal that was very quick to take advantage of it to steal stuff. And meanwhile, the police, who were trained on Agatha Christie novels, it took 5 to 7 years to figure out what internet crime looked like and how you could possibly defend against it. Right? You have that kind of mismatch between attacker and defender. And because of that, you're always going to have what I call a security gap, right, between what the defenders can do and what the attackers can do. And the result is a natural advantage for attackers. And if you think about it, I give a bunch of examples in the book, that the security gap is greater if there's more technology, and it's greater in times of rapid technological and social change. Right? Attackers get more of an advantage. And in our society right now, there is more technology than ever before, and we are living in a time of the greatest technological and social change than we've ever seen, ever before. So we're now living in a world where the security gap is the greatest. Right? This means it's going to be hard to get societal pressures right. This is actually going to be a hard problem. I've recently come to the belief that our best hope is not to get ahead of the attackers, but to be able to react faster. And you sort of see this meme starting to rise in the security community. I've heard it called agile security or reactive security or lean security. Right? The idea that we can't predict what the attacker will do next, but the best thing we can do is notice what they do and respond quickly. That we can maintain security that way. And I think that is a result of this sort of fundamental realization that we're not going to close the security gap, that the best thing we can do is react to it. But on the other hand, technology isn't all bad, right? Technology helps societal pressures scale too. You think of I don't know what's a good example. Historically, if you wanted a loan, a bank loan, you'd go to a bank where the bank officer knew you, and they would give you a loan or not, depending on your reputation. Right? A perfectly reasonable, reputational-based security system. Now what happens, at least in the U.S., is everyone has a credit score. They go into a random bank anywhere in the country, and they get a loan based on their credit score. That credit score is a technologically enhanced reputational system. Now, you can complain about how it doesn't work, and problems with it, but it allows the banking system to scale nationally and even globally. Right? eBay's feedback system is another great example of a reputational-based security system. Now, you can argue, and I've seen them, not made in this way, but I've seen historians argue that writing, right, that the technology of writing is a mechanism for scaling moral pressure. Being able to take your religious and ethical texts and write them down and transfer them from individual to individual that way, right, is a way to scale that. Right? All sorts of technologies help institutional pressures, help laws scale. Right? And better technologies, certainly also scale. All right, so sort of one final problem, and I hinted at this earlier, right, is that society isn't always right. A lot of what I'm talking about are how groups enforce their norms on individuals in the group, right? Group interest versus self-interest. Right? The implicit assumption is that the group is correct, but that's not necessarily true. Right? The group could be enforcing a social norm like slavery, right? Or torture, right? Or not giving women the vote. And those who oppose that are the defectors, right, are the ones breaking the norms, right, are the ones who society punishes, but sometimes in the end they are morally right. Right? So this process is also the mechanism for social change. Right? This is how society grows, through defectors. All right, so a couple of final points. Right? No matter how much societal pressure you deploy, there'll always be defectors. Right? You cannot get the defection rate down to 0. It's just too expensive and the diminishing returns are too great. Right? So increased societal pressure isn't always worth it. Right? More police isn't always a good idea. More people badging at this conference isn't always a good idea. Right? Societal pressures actually prevent cooperation too. Because whenever you have a system to punish defectors, there are always going to be false alarms. Right? Sometimes you mistakenly punish the innocent, and those false alarms have an effect. Right? We all defect at some times regarding some things. Nobody is 100% a cooperator. Right? And there are good defectors and there are bad defectors, and we can't always tell the difference. And lastly, and most importantly, society needs defectors. Right? The group benefits from the fact that some of us within the group do not follow the group norms. Right? And this is how we get social change. So that's what I have prepared. I'm happy to take questions, first on this topic and then on any topic. I know there's always lots of interesting questions at conferences like this. I did bring a box of books that they're selling at the table over there. I do have book flyers. This is thinner than the normal book. The benefit is it's free. The problem is there's far fewer words. So there's a stack there and a stack there at the end of the talk, and you grab one. So, are there any questions? Yes, down here.
Wait, I'll just grab a mic.
All right, we're going to try to run a microphone around for questions.
Good morning. Thank you for your talk. I'd like to ask, what do you think about the security industrial complex? There's a large lobby of people who earn a lot of money to put pressure on politicians to spend more money on, well, systems that make our surveillance society of our societies in Europe and in the United States.
So I have no argument about that. I mean, there is definitely, certainly in the U.S. and Europe, a very strong lobbying group in several mechanisms, right? There is the group lobbying to make us all scared of cyber war, to induce more spending there. There's groups that are inducing spending in surveillance and other technologies. There's lobbying groups for airline security. I mean, I'm certainly not happy about it. I think there's a lot of extraordinary waste and abuse and loss of liberties because of these groups. It is a very real problem, and I'm not sure we have a good solution. But I have no disagreement with your characterization of the problem.
So you have no answer? Any?
You mean what's the 4-sentence thing you can do to solve the problem? Oh God, I wish I had an answer like that.
Like EFF and ACLU, and in Holland we have similar groups. That's the only answer.
I don't know if it's the only. If it's the only answer, it's kind of a crap answer. I don't have a good answer. I mean, this is a major societal problem. And yes, it's something that I think we need to fight every opportunity we can. It's kind of a losing battle, right? I try to fight this as much as possible. I'm not doing that great.
Yeah.
So no, I wish I had a better answer for you.
Okay, thank you.
There's hands over there. There's a hand back there. You're in charge. You run it from person to person. Just try to mix it around the room.
Yeah. You talk about the 4 forces that enforce good behavior, and our work field seems to be mainly concentrated about the 4th force. Mm-hmm. What could we do to make those first 3 forces be more recognized by regulatory bodies? That's the people that look at us.
It's a good question. I'm not sure about regulatory bodies, but certainly I think we should use them more. I mean, that example of the experiment with the pair of eyes in the coffee machine is a great example. I mean, if I put a pair of eyes on a banking website, does that mean there's going to be less banking fraud? Maybe. Someone should run the experiment. I mean, I think about eBay. and eBay feedback is a purely reputational system to reduce fraud. I'd like it if our community would start thinking more creatively about ways we can leverage moral pressures, reputational pressures, institutional pressures in what we do. Because I think we're missing quite a lot of pieces to a security toolbox. Now, how to get them recognized by a regulatory body is another issue. I think they have to demonstrate effectiveness. But I do think there's a lot of things we can do. There's experiments done in banking fraud that demonstrated that if the criminal is induced to think of his victim as a person, he's less likely to commit the crime. Right? So there's some way we can personalize transactions in a way that reduces fraudulent transactions. There's great research in behavioral psychology on a lot of these topics. And we've largely not paid attention to them because, let's face it, we're technologists and we want to come up with a clever crypto protocol that solves the problem. And that's all well and good, but I kind of want us to start looking at these other ways. And one of the first steps is to recognize that the whole notion of solve the problem is the wrong way to think about it. Because we're never going to solve the problem. We're just going to reduce the incidence of defection to some manageable rate. Right? And whether we do that via a firewall or we do that via social shaming, that's going to depend on the details of what we're trying to solve. All right, so who has the microphone now?
I think we've got a question at the back there.
You got to raise your hand because I don't know who you are. Oh, here you are.
Yes.
Because you're coming from up there as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, yeah, that's nice. I'm all the way around now. Anyway, I think the difference, or actually there is no difference between moral and reputational-based pressure. Just anything other than the number of observers. Because I think we know morals because we learned that it might harm our reputation.
That seems, it's an argument, and this is getting into heavy philosophy that I kind of slough in the book a little bit. You can make that argument. It does seem like when you look at the neuroscience of the brain that there is a difference. But since both evolved simultaneously, both are very interrelated. You can argue, and I think it's a reasonable argument, that you can't separate them out. I separate them out primarily as a mechanical exercise because the way they operate from a security perspective are a little bit different. But yes, it's a perfectly reasonable argument to say that, hey, they're really two aspects of the same thing. Philosophically, you can't pull them apart. And there's a lot of literature that supports that argument. There's literature that supports the other arguments, and that itself is actually a good book to write, and I wish somebody would write it. It wouldn't be me, because it is much more of a psychological and neuroscience and philosophical discussion. But you make a very valid point, and I don't necessarily disagree. I just chose in the book to separate them out.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, there are two microphones. There are three microphones. This can get dangerous.
Hi. So basically, my question is, every time that I read a book, they are mostly very absolutist, and they think that what they wrote in it is like basically global, and numbers are sometimes different. So I want to know if you look into like global society or just Occidental society, because world population, if you distribute worldwide, if you take China, Russia, you have most of the population. So that's basically
right.
I want to know if you cover in your book like all society, or is like just centric to one specific society.
So it's the principles I talk about, I think, are more universal. How they're instantiated is very local. I mean, I'm looking at the notion of a group and group interest. And the group sizes are different depending on the issue and depending on the age. I mean, there have been natural sizes of our communities based on technology, whether they're villages or towns or cities or countries or or continents or global. So, there are very different group sizes. And a lot of the mechanisms I talk about are the same regardless of size. They instantiate differently. Certainly, there are a lot of cultural differences in groups, which I think are extremely important. Then when you look at group norms, whether you're living in the United States or living in Japan, right, there are very different group norms and very different definitions of what constitutes cooperative behavior. So I move around in group size in the book because I'm trying to tease out more universal positions. But there's a lot of detail in group specifics that really make a difference.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
All right, the person's in charge of questions says one more. How about... Oh, okay, you win.
I have the mic, so I win.
You are the last question. You will be judged by your peers on the quality of your question. Not to put any pressure on you, mind you.
I'm Raghav Rao from Buffalo, New York. Thanks for a fascinating lecture. My question is regarding the other side of the coin to security, that is privacy. And the second part of the question is, I'd like to have your views with regard to the senior citizen community.
Sorry, the what?
The senior citizens, the elders. Privacy and...
So, that's an extremely complex topic. And I've written a lot about privacy. Privacy, I maintain, is a very important social good. That it is something that is essential to all societies. On the other hand, it is also very contextual. And there are cultural norms with regard to privacy. There are generational norms with regard to privacy. And we're living in a world right now of rapid change in privacy norms. And my main fear and worry is that a lot of these changes are being orchestrated by companies that have a financial interest in controlling what the norms are. So an easy example is Facebook. Right? Facebook makes money by you having less privacy, so they are pushing social changes where less privacy is expected. And I think that's very dangerous. I don't know if I've answered the question. I feel like, if I start in this topic, I won't come up for air for another 40 minutes. So I'm a little loath to get into it. But there's a lot of bad memes about privacy going around our community. That like young people don't care about privacy. Which, of course, if you think about it for a second, is bullshit. Right? Ask any young person. They care a lot about privacy. But what's going on is our societal debates about privacy are now have lobbyists, effectively, right? For-profit entities that are trying to manipulate the debate. And I think we have a chance of getting it badly wrong because of that. On the other hand, these are all short-term changes. We're living in a world where things are changing so fast. Fast forward 10, 20 years, I think we're likely to get it right because privacy is valued, even though we might not think about it. But it's probably going to take that long because of the generational issues, because of the difficulty in understanding technology. That we will need people who are born into these technologies to figure out what the right balance is. Right, so I'm going to get off the stage.
Okay. I just want to thank you
He's approaching
very
me with
much
a microphone. He's going to bean me over the head with it.
No, definitely not. I just want to thank you very much for your keynote, Bruce.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and enjoy your conference.
All right. Thank you, Bruce.